As I mentioned, for the month of May this year, we are focused on justice. We find the word justice in the Bible in a lot of places. In the law of Moses, in prophetic materials, and in the teachings of Jesus Christ. So what is justice? Do we need rules and laws in order to have justice? And how does our modern perspective compare to the perspective of Christ's teachings? In modern terms, we tend to talk about law and justice as if they're the same thing. Laws are usually assumed to be just. We don't generally separate laws from justice. And we don't try or even know how to measure or to determine if a particular law is just or not, if it's just for everyone, before we implement them. And if we assume all laws are just, we might think that justice, in terms of just whether or not someone's guilty or not of breaking a law, meaning when someone who's guilty of a crime gets away with it, right? That's an injustice. Or when someone who's innocent gets punished instead, that feels like even more of an injustice. This is a very individualistic view of justice. It centers around an act by an individual who breaks a law or a societal rule. And with this worldview, we tend to assume that it's the lawbreaker. It's the law-breaking individual that's the problem, not the law. But the Bible reminds us that laws are not always just, and that even good and just laws can be applied in unjust manner. And that feels like an especially important message for the times we're living in today. It's a message that was important back in biblical times, which is why teachings about justice are so prominent throughout the Bible. Jesus and the prophets talk about this a lot. Back then, and to this day, laws were too often written and applied in such a way as to give the wealthy and the powerful a huge advantage when compared to the poor and the powerless. It happens when the powerful abuse their power to their own advantage. We sometimes refer to this kind of thing as might makes right. You've heard of that before. Such practices have been the source of some of the biggest injustices in the world throughout history. Invaders, people who start wars, use and abuse their power by resorting to violence to kill their enemy, which is the opposite of Christ's teachings. This was the situation when Jesus lived. The Romans did whatever the Romans wanted to do when it came to dealing with others. The entire Roman system of government was based on violence, on might makes right practices. Rome abused its power to appropriate resources at the expense of the poor and the powerless. This tradition of might makes right, or we have the power to do what we want, and you can't stop us. Sound familiar? It's been the source of massive injustice throughout history. Continues to this day. For example, attempts to implement laws at the international level have been blocked historically, almost always by whatever the most powerful country of the time was. There are real limits to what international law can do when the most powerful nation in the world, no matter if that's the USA or whether that's ancient Rome, does not want to be held accountable for their actions. When might makes right, when abuse of power is the rule rather than the exception, international law can't be effective. It's a big reason why movements to try to pass international laws or treaties to provide even a baseline of protections against abuses have almost always failed. For example, there was an international treaty to protect children's rights. And who's the one country that's rejected it? The USA. We are the only country that has refused to support even this most basic agreement. The International Law of the Sea has not been ratified by the USA. The International Criminal Court has not been ratified by the USA or by China or by Russia or by India, some of the largest, most powerful countries. And this practice of might makes right is not limited to international law. It's practiced at the local level as well. In Jesus' time, powerful Pharisees and Sadducees were famous for acting in their own self-interest more so than observing the law of Moses. Jesus frequently championed the cause of the powerless, of the widow, of the poor, and of the rejected, because that's where local injustices were found in ancient Jerusalem. He saw it every day. Laws and practices that make the weak suffer so the powerful can feel safe and comfortable. Laws that take from the poor so the powerful can have more are at the center of many of Christ's teachings. Slavery in the USA is another historic example of abuse of power, of the concept that might makes right. It took the loss of over 500,000 people during the Civil War to end slavery, because slavery stole so much wealth and power, it was almost impossible to stop. And the abuse of power directed at black people in our nation did not stop with slavery. Slavery was replaced with segregation by unjust racial laws such as redlining and Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow laws and segregation hurt black people while concentrating power, wealth, and comfort within the white community. The civil rights movement in the 1960s was a great example of a movement driven by the principles taught by Jesus in response to unjust laws and practices. When laws are adopted that help one group of people, but not others, this should be a huge red flag for us, a clear indication of injustice. Particularly when laws are implemented at the expense of a minority group without power. Justice is not as simple as just deciding whether a law has been broken, because a society's laws and the circumstances behind them are complicated. So justice requires that we consider whether the law is just and fair to begin with, and whether or not it will be applied fairly to everyone. Laws in Jesus' day were also complicated, maybe more so in that the people of Israel had two sets of laws they had to follow, Roman laws and Jewish laws. When we read and talk about law during Christ's lifetime, it's usually Jewish law that we're talking about rather than Roman law. Yet both of these sets of laws were in effect when Jesus was born. In the scripture passage we read today from the book of Matthew, Jesus mentions one of these Jewish laws directly. Jesus is dismayed about how closely some menial laws were being kept, while other much more important laws were being totally ignored. Now, Jewish law, as outlined in the Old Testament, required that 1/10 of livestock, of fruit trees, of grain and wine be presented to the temple for support of the priesthood, to make sure they complied with the law. Some scribes and Pharisees even tithed small garden vegetables used for seasoning, well above and beyond what was required by the law. And that's what Jesus is talking about in this passage. Jesus is calling out how these folks are following the law about tithing to a ridiculous degree, even including small spices like mint, dill, and cumin, while ignoring the big stuff: justice, mercy, and faith. Jesus sees as far more important. He calls justice, mercy, and faith weightier matters. The Jewish religious officials were spending much of their time and attention on these little details while allowing huge injustices to go unchallenged. They were allowing the powerful to abuse the weak while focusing on and being distracted by things like making sure they counted out 1/10 of even their spices. Which is why Jesus called them blind. You're blind. He said, you strain out a gnat, but swallow a camel. Okay, agricultural metaphors that can be a little different. You're saying you're paying a lot of attention to the silly things. All laws are not equal to Jesus. Matters of justice, mercy, and trust are bigger and more important than more mundane laws. Now, the text does not explain what Jesus means by justice, mercy, and faith or trust in this particular passage. But when we look at Christ's teachings as a whole, we find that Jesus is usually concerned about justice and mercy for the poor, the widow, the outcast, the sick, and the powerless. The victims. Jesus is concerned about the victims of widespread abuse of power. Abuses he saw all around him. There's plenty of justice and mercy for the wealthy in Jesus' time, but very little justice or mercy for the poor. Laws intended to make sure that the poor, that orphans, and that widows had enough to survive on, routinely ignored. When a poor person appeared before a judge in a case against a wealthy person, guess who typically won? Typically the wealthy person. The other passage we read today is from 1 Corinthians, and it's also about the law and not using power to the disadvantage of others. When the Christian church was being created, as the first churches gathered and began teaching the way of Jesus, questions about the law and about justice came up a lot. Because the diversity of the early church, a diversity that went well beyond Jewish culture, Paul believed that forcing the new Christian church to follow the Jewish laws would be a disaster. At the same time, Paul encouraged people to follow Roman laws. Not because Roman laws were just, they were not. But because if otherwise, the Romans would attack Christians with even more intensity. So that's what Paul is trying to address in this passage. Paul recognizes that almost any law can be used in unjust ways. Paul taught that our actions should be guided by what is best for all, including the poor. Paul says that as citizens or as Christians, we should never exercise our rights in a way that harms others, that we should never abuse our power. And Jesus' teachings go further, telling us that laws must not only be fair and just for all, but fair and just specifically for the poor. When laws are not beneficial to all, it's almost always the poor who are mistreated, overlooked, incarcerated, or worse. Jesus noticed how leaders had a tendency to get focused on following sets of rules that distract us from the weightier matters: justice, mercy, and love for neighbor. In those teachings, Jesus' teachings about justice and mercy and loving God and our neighbor, those have always been at the core of who we are as a church. While some churches focus more on following rules and determine who's saved and who's not, our church has tended to focus more on the path of justice that Jesus taught. That's why historically we've been willing to challenge rules and norms that separate people from Jesus' teachings. Most of you have heard the story of our church's founding before. Our church started in 1894 because a group of people rejected existing church rules that were keeping them from helping the poor and the sick. Our church was literally created out of a situation of a powerful church that had rules that were hurting the poor. That happened 132 years ago. If you don't know the story, ask me sometime or another member. The point is, Jesus taught that we should focus on justice and mercy and faith, the big stuff, the weightier matters. And so for 132 years here at St. John's, we've at least tried to do that. We focus less on the human tendency to create all sorts of rules, and instead we focus on God's love and grace. It is true that clear, strict rules and laws are helpful for some people. Depending on where someone is on their spiritual path, someone can easily be at a place where having strict rules is very helpful to keep people from feeling adrift. Someone like that might find our lack of church rules and laws a concern. There are a lot of different churches out there. And part of the reason for that is depends on where people are in their lives. People need different sorts of support, depending on where they're at in their spiritual journey. As for our church, our calling, our course has been one based on love and inclusion for everyone rather than on rules. Because too often rules create outsiders, and too often it's the powerful who makes the rules. Jesus was clear. The highest law is love for God and for neighbor, not to make or follow rules that marginalize others. St. John's Church, since our inception, has been reluctant to follow rules that we saw as unloving or unhelpful or that limited the rights of the powerless. We do have rules, right? We have our bylaws and we have our open and affirming statement. Our bylaws lay out the organizational structure, and our open and affirming statement puts in writing our agreed upon principles of inclusion rather than exclusion. Our rules don't focus on who we reject. You can't come here. You can't come. No, we do the opposite. We focus on who we can affirm. Yep, you can come. Yeah, you too. Notice a little difference in approach there? Rather than having rules that decide who cannot belong, we have rules that facilitate who can. Facilitate inclusion, as long as the safety of everyone is protected. Safety is where we draw the line in terms of inclusion. Our commitment to being a safe place means that we do not accept people who bully, who threaten in any way, for example. We do not accept might over right. As a church, we as a church are following Jesus and his teachings as best we can. Our mission, our calling has always been one of grace and mercy. Historically, laws that target a particular group are more about fear than justice, more about power than mercy. For example, the recent flourish of anti-trans laws undermines our trans siblings' safety and their emotional and spiritual well-being. These are some of the weightier things that Jesus calls us to focus on. Rejecting such laws and practices that only apply to some people. We as an inclusive church have said no to unjust laws before, and I have a sense that we're going to be called to do so again in the future. To follow the law of love rather than fear. To seek out not our own advantage in politics or otherwise, but to seek out the good of all. For only when love rather than power is our guide, only then will our laws have any chance of being just and fair as defined by Jesus Christ.